We've talked about a lot of things, a lot of behavioral insights, a lot of ways of applying them, but ultimately none of it matters unless we can scale change, because we also know how daunting change is, and we know how big the change is that we need. So eventually, if you're going to talk about scale, you're going to talk about money. You're going to need a lot of it, and you're going to need political support. You're going to need those environment ministers. You're going to need heads of state. You're going to need to bring in the big guns. So everybody knows how much I love Costa Rica. So can someone just take a photo of me real quick? Mom?
I left my phones there, so I cannot.
Or a selfie? Mom, I have a real job. Look, El Presidente. Thank you for coming.
No, my pleasure.
So let's talk about scale. Carlos Manuel, your former, was he a good employee, by the way?
Yes, really good.
Okay. Sorry, Carlos. Former employee, former Minister of Environment, and he's talking about integration and talking about behavior change. What can a president do? So we're now here. We've gone from rural communities to ministers, behavioral academics. Now we're going to talk with a president. 30 by 30. 30 by 30 is something designed when you look down at the planet and you think, we're going to set aside 30% of the ocean. We're going to set aside 30% of land. And yet here we're talking about behavior change. Help us bring those two ideas together.
Well, Brett, I think last segment is a great transition to this, because we tend to have this kind of dualist ideas as either individual change or structural change. And I think we have to have, as Sarah Constantino said, a more integrative approach to it. Let me tell you a little bit how 30 by 30 started, at least from my experience. It was 2019, and it was actually a really small, fairly small group of people, ministers of environment, even some of finance, scientists, saying, hey, we need to protect 30% of both oceans and land in order for us to keep life in this planet. That was the insight, and science backed that up. But it was not a structural movement. It was relatively a fairly small group of people. And what was their behavioral change? They decided to act and say, let's do this. And from there, a small group, the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People was born. And the first thing everybody said was, this is very ambitious. This is impossible. This is not going to happen. But then, after that first step of attitude change, another thing starts to happen. A couple of months passed from 2019, and then there were not the 5 initial countries alone. There were 40 countries that joined that. So you start to sense the peer pressure. I mean, countries advancing, and then they start to say, well, but it's only small countries like Costa Rica and other guys like the UK and France, but you know, but then you start to see larger countries that start to join the movement. And one last point to that, after that initiative, some peer pressure, comes example. I remember in COP in Glasgow, in that COP, 4 of the countries, in this case Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador, we decided to act beforehand and to pledge this commitment to expand our protected areas to 30%. In the case of Costa Rica, we had only 3% of our ocean protected. And Costa Rica is 92% ocean. So we pledged that. And in Glasgow, we all did pledge that. And actually, that same December, I signed the expansion to the protected area. So example, showing how it's done, eventually creates more momentum. And it was a year after. Let's remember, 2019, impossible, not going to happen. 2022, Montreal, Kunming COP, the 15th COP. December, more than 190 countries commit to the 30 by 30. So that's something that started as a movement in a small room with a few group of people changing views, behavior in policy, and eventually pressure and example made that a reality as it is now.
I'm just curious, which country signed first?
Good question. But you see, that's another thing that I believe it made it successful. The straightforward answer is, I don't know. But that's good, because one thing was that movement was not owned by a few. You know, I think that was part of the success. It was not a phase or only one country. To make it successful, you need everybody on board. Leading, actually good leadership there, meant following and becoming part of the movement. So I think one of the success, it was not a brand or a thing of a political figure or a country. It became a movement across the spectrum of nations. And I think it was not egotistical as many think nowadays. It was very open-hearted to receive and to inspire everybody to join.
You know, our team, especially the team in Colombia, and I'm thinking about Momo, who's right here, working with farmers all over the province of Meta. We talk a lot about social proof to social pressure. So the transition from establishing some really good practices in a place and then making them visible. Several people on stage today talked about observability. Your example was essentially social proof with those 5. But can presidents and ministers really create social pressure at the COP? What does that look like for some of us who don't spend a lot of time in those hallways?
Well, yes. At that forum, we can create pressure. Usually we receive pressure back home. That was usually happens more often. But I think to this point of scale and of pressure, there's one nuance, and it's relevant to point out. The typical case of scaling up that we learned in business or universities is you have a proof of concept, you go out there, you test it, you have a pilot, hopefully a successful pilot, and then you go, let's scale this up. And I believe that's not necessarily the best approach. What is that you need to scale up? You need to scale up the ultimate goal and some of the behavior. Why? And what is that I've seen in that, but in other cases? Usually my experience is that when you scale up, the specific tactics or scheme that you use in one place and you try to implant it in another might fail. But I've seen that the richness actually of that example or some peer pressure is, for me, in my own agency, in my community, in my country, or in my environment, to find a solution, my solutions to that common objective, to deal with it. I think that's a key insight, not to try to, okay, we did this here, let's scale it up across the board. No, every community, as they say now, and I believe it's so true, every adaptation to climate change is local at the end of the day. The actions happens in a block, in a neighborhood, in a school, in a community. So we need that agency, and that behavioral happens in a very human scale. And what human scale is not global scale. Human scale is community scale. But we can never underestimate the power that has and the power to replicate. I mean, I sometimes have the temptation to say replicate as a virus, but after COVID, it's never a good idea. But somehow the principle, good ideas have that power, and good example possess that power to replicate, especially if they are positive, especially if they are rooted in things. And I love that one of the insights that Oliver showed when he presented about the books that he's doing. The insight, for example, of love. Love pushes people to do things, change behavior. For example, when they think about the future generations, children. Could be their children, could be children in general. Love can make change in behavior happen. So I think we also need to leverage that.
So I'm tempted to talk about love, but I'm going to move back to where you started, which was we spend a lot of time at RARE trying to dispel the myth that it's either or, individual behavior change or systemic change, that they're irreconcilably different. And yet, when I think about Costa Rica, when I lived in Costa Rica in the early 1990s, it had possibly the highest rate of deforestation at least in Central America, if not Latin America, and yet it has come full circle and restored so much habitat that it's breathtaking. There were policies involved, rules and regulations, information, material incentives. You and Carlos Manuel created the payment for ecosystem services. There was also a lot of behavior change. So think about scaling reforestation and regeneration nationwide. How do you explain what a president does versus what a community does? What does it actually take to achieve that amazing success?
It has to do with many factors, and in that regard it's complex. The simplicity of it comes when it comes to the objectives. Has to do with example, the first adopters. They then show the others, okay, this is how I can protect forests, and also have business, a healthy business aside on that. And others will say, well, I can do that too. And then when you see a conglomerate of people doing that, they say, oh, now we have a tourism cluster. So that becomes a trigger but then you have to also align the public policy, the public opinion. So many of the insights we've seen in these presentations do apply to reality in many levels. It's multidimensional. I also think that integrative thinking it's required. As you said, it's not one or the other. Sometimes it's both or more. I think also nature and history of humankind shows us the way. There are many communities that, indigenous communities in Latin America, for example, they will say, I am with the river, or I am with the land, because without the land or without the river, there's no me. In the south of Africa, I am because you are. And many other philosophies that don't make this separation between nature and humankind. And we do that very, very often. Even, think about this, we have different verbs for to think and to feel. Is there a thinking separating to feel in one body? While we are feeling, we are thinking at the same time, and both are influencing one another. But we tend to make this divide. And that's a behavioral change too. That means we need to think and feel at the same time when we act, and allow ourselves to do that. I think that's one of we have the energy transition, we have the food transition. Perhaps we also need a soul transition in this process to achieve. And that, it's also behavioral change, my friend.
And that I love. We're going to take the soul transition pledge at the next Beehive.
That's why the Bob Marley song. Is this love or what?
Is this love? So, one of the things we've been thinking a lot about with, for example, our fisheries work. There are now 2,000 communities around the world that are adopting the Fish Forever program. You're going to hear more about that in just a couple of minutes. When we are invited, or when we encourage someone to invite us to come help, there's always the question about how we're going to motivate a head of state, how we're going to motivate an environment minister or a finance minister. Increasingly, we're thinking about financial structures that will enable us to scale behavior change. So as we think about an impact bond, I know you're a member of the Club of Madrid as a former head of state. How are we going to change the behavior of heads of state and of finance ministers to understand the value of investing in people in addition to infrastructure, and investing in some of the skills and approaches that we've been talking about today? Because ultimately, that is the challenge for the people in the room today. How do we make this one of the key ways we change behavior in the world for the benefit of all of us?
This is my view. I don't want to make it like a full certainty, but I think even the insights discussed here, or that RARE has gathered for research, are valid to heads of state too. Some people are moved by inspiration, ethical means, and those are perhaps the early adopters. They want to go in, they want to do the right thing, but they are not all that are out there. And you might have changes in government. So how you manage not to change the policy? Well, there are other incentives, peer pressure, And that's made mostly by citizens, by individuals showing the way, saying this is good, this is important, as the research shown about the views on people on conservation. But also showing other avenues. I mean, we don't only have to show the ethical, important avenue that many of us are inspired for. For example, showing it's good for business. And it is good for business. It is good for having a sustainable livelihood for fisheries, but also it's a way to attract tourism, sustainable tourism. It's also a way to attract the interest of financial institutions or philanthropy. So in developing world, as I have experienced, you need the finance to make change. And that's a way to attract it. And for others that are not moved either for those or that, for those reasons, they want to win elections. And if people want this agenda, they can claim that when they voting. So some people might not be that interested. They say, oh, but X% of the electorate cares about this. I better care about this too. So there's a whole spectrum of possibilities in which to act. Again, there is not only one path or one or the other. It's a diversity of paths, and it's how the human intelligence needs to work to persuade to have those behavioral changes.
Please join me in thanking former President of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado.